It's
God.
about a subway.
Yeah.
Believe in
Why is
Jesus.
yours so? Why is yours?
Bigger thing, you know, it's a,
Because he's a,
Believe in
he's a-
Jesus.
He's a
Well,
real.
your number is 1 out of 4,000,
He's a
right?
real. He's
you
a real one.
You agreed 4,000. 1 out of
But
4,000.
he said
How
as
did
many
you figure
as
it out?
believed in him.
How many different currencies are there in the world?
As many as believed in
A lot.
him.
Well, we count
So you want to
He
just give
gave
me all
them
your money?
power.
Huh?
You want to give me all your money?
Why would you say that?
He gave them
What's
power
your
to
argument?
become sons
Because
of
there's
God.
so many current fake
As many as believed in
currencies there. You're making an argument that there
Fair
can't
enough.
be a real
So what makes? How do you know that the God you're talking
Hallelujah.
about is the right one?
Because of Jesus. He's the only one who manifested himself in the flesh. No
Salvation
other
is
God
a
has
free gift of
come
God.
to earth and manifested
That
himself.
story has been around a lot. It's been duplicated many times. I'm sure you're aware. There
God
are many
is a
texts of
God
many
of love.
religions with similar stories, similar to the Jesus
But
story.
after the
Oh, I'm not
rapture,
necessarily against. Was raised
things will
Christian.
never be the
Read
same
the Bible
again.
multiple times. Been a believer for a long time.
Were you born again?
No, because I always doubted it. And then you know what happened? Here's my
the
thing
Bible
about
says,
religion.
except you are born
I say
again, you
this to you
cannot
in
see the
humility.
kingdom of
You were
God.
never a Christian.
Maybe
You
so.
must be
Okay.
born
In your words,
again.
maybe
I'm
so,
just
maybe
saying.
so, maybe
And
so.
And there are
Jesus
no
is
two
so.
ways
You
about
know what
that.
happened, and I find this to be the case a lot.
Heaven
The
is
more
a
you
place
read
of
about
holiness.
any religion, whichever the case may be, the more you realize.
Heaven is a place for
Come over here.
for the
We're right in
sanctified
front of the
soul.
speaker. I
The
can't
more
hear.
the more I read about religion, the more I
A
realized
place for the sanctified soul.
the more I realized it can't possibly be
We
true.
are seen
The more
cannot go.
educated, I educated myself. The more I educated myself, the more I realized there was like no chance it was
Can I
real.
stop you?
Yes, please.
You use the word true.
Yes.
That's an absolute statement. What's your absolute standard for truth if it's not from God?
I'll tell you this about God. I think this is a way to answer your question. I think this is a way to answer your question. I'm totally accepting of the opportunity of a God, but I'm waiting for the evidence. So, like, I would love there to be a God, but I'm just waiting for the evidence.
You use another absolute standard. You said evidence, another absolute word.
I would agree that's an absolute word. I'm looking for absolute
Evidence all presuppose an absolute truth exists. Absolute truth presupposes God exists.
Okay.
If you don't
I don't
agree,
think I disagree with any of that.
good. Now, if God exists or could exist,
will end up in hellfire.
can He manifest Himself to you that you would know that He exists?
Anything is possible. I'm open to the evidence. If there was evidence that proved him to God, I would be so happy.
What would you consider evidence? Who do you believe existed in history?
I believe everybody that there's evidence for exists in history. For instance, I believe you exist. I'm talking to you right now. I believe people of evidence like that means.
How about Alexander the Great?
It's my understanding there's evidence that he exists. I can't.
Do you know there's tons and tons of more evidence that Jesus exists?
Give me one piece of evidence that proves Jesus exists.
Matthew.
By the way, I'm going to cut you off, and then I'm going to let you talk. If you were to literally be able to give me one piece of evidence that Jesus existed, you would literally break the world, break the internet. There is literally no evidence that Jesus. Stop for 1 second. I'm going to let him talk. If you were to give me one piece of evidence that Jesus existed, you would literally be the most famous man to ever exist in modern history. Please do it.
The word, you keep using evidence, but you don't have an absolute standard for truth.
Give me the evidence. Come on, man. You said you're going to give me evidence.
Evidence presupposes absolute truth.
Fair
absolute
enough.
truth.
Give me some
then
evidence.
that's your evidence. That's your evidence that God exists.
That is not evidence. You must not understand. Sir, I'm going to cut this off. You do not understand what evidence means if you think that's what evidence for Jesus.
What evidence you need an absolute you need an absolute standard. You need an absolute standard to determine if the evidence is true or not.
I asked you to give me evidence that God exists, and you didn't do it.
I'm not going to give you the platform. You don't even have a platform to stand on to make an argument for evidence. That's my whole point. You're missing the point.
No. So do you understand who the burden of proof is on in this? If you're supposing that God exists,
presupposes absolute truth.
If you suppose that a God exists, it's up to you to prove it, not me to disprove it.
Proof. You're missing the whole point. It's going way over your head.
Oh my God.
Proof. Yeah, God exists. I know. That. Proof presupposes
Are these your
absolute
kids?
truth.
And you do this in front of them? I actually consider this child abuse to an extent. I really do.
Sure. Proof presupposes.
You laughed, your son laughed.
Proof presupposes absolute truth. You have no standard for truth without God's.
I asked you for a piece of evidence, and you said truth presupposes.
You're missing the point. What? Okay. How do you determine? Is there absolute truth?
So.
Is there absolute truth?
There is not absolute truth. There is totally not.
Is that absolutely true?
To my knowledge,
is that absolutely true?
I'm going to answer
is that absolutely? I'm going to hold you to it.
Is what absolutely true?
That there's no absolute truth.
You're playing word games. Go one more time. To my understanding, there's no absolute truth.
You can't ask for. I stand on the foundation that God is my absolute standard for truth. Whether you agree or not.
I understand.
What do you stand on? Because you're using truth without justifying.
I'll give you an answer to that.
Okay.
I stand on that I'm open to everything of which there's evidence.
That's not the
for.
answer.
That is an answer. That's my answer.
You're putting the
Why
cart
can't I
before
be
the
open
horse.
to things that there are evidence for?
I'm not saying you can't.
You're-
I'm not saying you can't.
I
What
don't
I'm saying.
think you understand the words that are coming out of your mouth.
You're using words you can't justify yet. You're way ahead of you. You're way ahead of yourself. Justify your words and then start using it.
Okay.
Don't borrow from me. You're borrowing from me right now.
I'm trying to use your own words.
Go ahead.
Listen,
Where does the absolute stand? That's where you have to start and then start building. Right
I'm
now,
not gonna
you
play-
don't have
listen,
legs to stand on.
I let you talk for a minute. I'm not going to play your words game.
It's not a words game.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
You won't let me talk. You
God,
make me answer your.
God is my
your
absolute
questions
standard.
are nonsense. They don't even make sense.
That's fine. God is my absolute standard. Whether you agree or not, God is my absolute standard.
How long have you been looking into this?
God is my absolute standard for truth, whether you agree or not. Okay.
I understand.
Okay. What's your absolute standard? And then we argue from there. You don't have it, but you want to start arguing from it. That's why you're missing the point.
I don't know that. I think that's okay, let me give you an example. If I were to ask you, I'm trying to answer your question.
Don't use absolute words.
I think your question is a silly question. I'm going to give you an analogy that proves that your question is a silly question. If I were to ask you, what the color of green is, that's a stupid question. To you to ask me what the absolute standard of truth is a nonsense question.
Why?
There's no standard for truth.
Is that true? Is that true?
There is no standard.
Is that true?
It's true that we
Is that
can't.
true?
It's true that we absolutely cannot
Is that
prove
true?
anything. Yes, it is absolutely.
So there is an absolute standard. See?
Listen.
You can't deny
I
knowledge.
appreciate you kids. You're very young. It's not a conversation.
You
with
can't
guys.
deny
Just say to
knowledge.
your father, I do feel as though
He'll
your father
rebuke
is
him. He'll refute you on his own.
Just say that between
He'll
you and I.
refute
I'll
you.
say this for your son. I truly feel like you are abusing your children, abusing
Why?
them, because you don't have evidence for what you're talking about. And you're
What's wrong with abuse in your worldview?
What's wrong with abuse? So
what's your standard? What's your standard?
So
what's your standard for
you're
right and wrong?
By the way, before I answer, and I will answer your question.
You have not answered one question yet. You're just babbling on
You have
and
yet to ask
on
a question
and
that's not a silly question.
What's
Ask me
your
one
what's
question
your
that's not a silly
standard? What's
question.
your standard for morality to say this is abuse? What's
My
your
standard for morality is the things that I believe deep down inside.
So
to
it
be
comes
true
from
or
you.
not. It comes from me, not from you.
What happens when you die? Where's morality?
How about this?
No, just answer.
What happens?
Just answer the question.
That is a stupid question. It makes
what's
no
smart
sense.
then? What's smart and
Your
dumb in
question
your worldview?
literally makes no sense.
What's
what
smart and dumb in your
morality
worldview?
when
How do you determine what's
sense in
smart
your
and dumb?
Where's sense in your
What?
I'll give you an
My
example.
friend, you are handicapped in your ideology right now. You have no legs. I took everything out. You know God exists because you're using absolute truth. I'm not trying to beat you in an argument.
I don't either.
Proving to you that you know God exists because you're using
Proving
absolute
nothing.
standard without
This
having
whole
one.
absolute standard, absolute truth is nonsense.
It's
This
not
is
nonsense.
This is nonsense.
You can't say
flabbergasted.
nonsense because that assumes that absolute truth.
No, you assume there's a God and
No.
then you don't have evidence for it. You assume there's a God and
If
you
I
don't
gave
have
you
evidence for it.
evidence, how will you determine if
You
it's true
don't-
or not? Here, I'll give you
By-
evidence. Let's say
the
this
way
is
you-
evidence, Exhibit A.
Listen.
No, listen. Let's say this is evidence.
I don't even think you understand how to
Let's
have a
just say this is
conversation.
Let's just say this is evidence,
I'm not gonna
exhibit.
read that.
Listen, let's say this is.
I've been studying. I don't know how old you are, but I've been studying this since my 20s.
Listen,
I'm
it didn't
older
do
than
you
I
any
was.
good. Listen, let's say this is evidence. Let's say this is evidence. No, don't give him anything, brother. Don't give him anything. Let's say this is evidence. By what standard are you going to determine if this is true or not?
If I have other, so let's say that's evidence of something. If I have other outside things that could prove that to be true, that would be evidence, which we don't have.
So if Nazis prove
Again.
that Hitler was right, was Hitler right?
Again, you're using. Again,
Can we do one thing at a time? Are we
Outside
gonna?
source.
I would love to address what you said, but your father won't let me. I don't know if he's both your sons, but whatever.
You don't have an absolute standard for morality. You don't have an absolute standard for
Can I tell you where morality comes
truth.
from? I'll tell you where I think. Well, I don't know this to be fact, but I'll tell you where I think.
But you use it to judge if that was abuse. You see the folly in your argument?
Yes.
There
No, I
you
don't
go.
say the folly, but I am using what I'm getting ready to tell you where I think morality comes from. I find it insulting that people, well, it doesn't matter, just religious, doesn't matter which, by the way, there are many religions, kids. I don't know if you realize there are many. The one that you believe in is
not in a
not the
religion.
most popular one. I'm
We're
assuming
not
you're
in a
Christian.
religion.
I'm assuming you're Christian.
That's a relationship with Jesus. He's a real person.
Listen.
He's not a religion.
Here's where I think morality comes from. And I find it insulting that people that are into religion think that they own morality.
I know. Just
You don't
tell us
know.
where it comes from.
So I think it
don't
comes
need to
from
speak.
genetics, it comes from DNA, it comes from survival of the fittest.
Well, who created
Let me
DNA?
finish. Let me finish. I taught you to talk for a minute. I believe that, and I don't know this to be fact, but there is some biological evidence to assume that there's survival of the fittest. I believe that people, the reason our race, let me finish.
strong-
let me
strong
finish.
is what's
Please, sir,
right.
let me finish. I'm just going to walk away in a second. I would love to have a conversation with you, but if
I
you
know
keep
you're
cutting me
going to
off, I
storm
won't do
off.
it.
I know.
I believe that humankind, let's say from the beginning of humankind, 2,000 years ago, that the people that got along the best, right? The people that got along the best, that were agreeable, that weren't disagreeable, were the ones that were to mate with each other. So the more agreeable people were the ones that were likely to get mates, and so on and so on and so on. So the more agreeable, let me finish it. I think you know where I'm going, but let me finish. I'll let you talk. So I believe that's where our morality is getting, because genetically, we mated with others that were agreeable, and that happened over thousands of years, and our morality is literally embedded in us
So
in
were
our
the
DNA.
Nazis wrong?
What's your standard for
Yes,
agreeable?
the Nazis were wrong. And
By what standard?
By the standard I literally just explained to you.
It
By the
met,
standard I literally
met
just
your
explained to you.
criteria. That's why I gave you as an example.
Yes, the Nazis.
They made it.
So if you're
They
not
were
agreeable,
they were in their
you
DNA.
would not
They all
get
agreed.
mates.
No, they all agreed.
If you're a Jew,
It was their
you do
culture.
not agree
If
with
you're
it.
not
All the
agreeable,
Nazis
you would
hated the
not get
Jews,
mates.
and they
But if there
killed
was
By
them.
the way,
morality,
I'm
there's
sure.
no good
do-
and bad.
Real
What?
quick, can we have a regular conversation without a yelling conversation?
By what? Because you don't answer. You're ducking every question.
You literally make up nonsense questions to say
No.
what is absolute truth. This is a nonsense question.
No, it's not.
It's no
Without
different
absolute truth, you
it's
can't
no
have
different than
anything.
asking how does green smell.
No.
Why is
no,
the
it's
sky
not.
blue?
You don't have
None of it-
absolute standard for truth, and you don't think that's important. You don't think truth is important.
I
You
think
don't
truth
think.
is
Where does
very
logic
important.
come from? Is logic universal? Is it
Everything
eternal?
that's encoded in our body is from DNA. Everything.
But what
That's
will
a
create
that's a
DNA, though?
that's an
Like, doesn't-
ambiguous answer
doesn't all
as I heard
creation
one.
show
So,
that
so
God
I'm going to
exists?
ask
So
you a question.
morality-
Do you understand the
morality
God of the
comes
So you
from-
just made a great argument that falls into this thing called the God of gaps. Can you explain to your sons what the God of the gaps is?
Look,
Explain to everyone here what the God of
he
the gaps
has
is.
no legs. I'm not going to give
If
him
you don't
any
know what
legs to
that
stand
is, you are
on.
so not ready for this conversation.
You
What
don't-
is the God of the gaps? Because he just
you
made a
don't-
great argument. for
What's
it.
wrong with God of the gaps in your worldview?
So here's the problem. So
You
just
don't
said-
even know if that could be true or not.
God, like literally,
You don't even know if you
I
have
let
a
you
true or
talk,
not.
and as right as I speak, you jump in my shit.
You don't know if that could be true or not.
So
You
you
mean like
said,
intelligent
repeat, can you
design?
repeat what you said?
I'm pretty much saying like intelligent design.
You said, where did
screens.
something come from? So you assume that if I don't know where something came from,
You don't know
God
anything.
did it. This is called the God of the gaps.
You don't know anything to any degree.
I don't know where it came from, so it means God did it. That's
No.
the God of the gaps. Are you
You
seriously
don't-
aware of this?
you
sir?
don't
This is
know-
like a basic argument.
You
for me to
don't
do
know
this.
anything to any degree outside of God.
And just so you know, I want you. I
You
want
have
nothing
not. You have
negative
not.
against you
Listen.
guys.
Listen.
Well,
You
I'm
have
saying
not.
that
I don't like where this
doesn't show
conversation
that
is
it
going.
has-
Because
If
you
don't
lost
know
in
and
every
there's a gap,
aspect.
doesn't
You
show
lost in
that-
every aspect. You don't know. You don't have a justice for. You don't have a.
Which is unnecessary.
You don't have a justification where for truth comes from.
Doesn't
you don't have
matter.
a justification for morality
So can I
comes
take
from.
your
And you're
money?
using truth, and you're
What would-
using
What would
morality.
you like money for,
So if
son?
I take your money,
What would you like money for?
You don't have
I
a
don't
you
care.
don't have a
What if I take
standard
your
for
money?
it.
What's wrong?
But you use it.
I explained to this man what was wrong with that. It's embedded in our DNA. Through,
It was embedded
through
in the
thousands
Nazi
of
It was
years
embedded
to
in the
not do
DNA.
things
It was
wrong.
embedded in the
But what
Nazis'
there even
DNA.
from the
So what's
beginning?
your explanation?
Love
We're
and
Nazis?
morality.
Yeah, it was embedded in their
embedded in their
DNA.
Certainly can be abnormalities. Are you kidding me?
No, it was embedded in their
Sure, got it.
DNA,
That's silly.
right? It was embedded in their DNA. It was a cultural norm at the time.
If you
It was
think
a
that
society
Christianity
norm.
has a
My
strong
friend, what I'm
morality,
saying
you're
is,
such
it
nonsense.
me- any
I'm just gonna start cutting you
anything
off because you do the same thing. to me.
any
Why don't
because
you have a reasonable conversation? Why don't
because
you let
you're
one
not
person talk?
answering my question.
You ask questions that are no different than what
Okay,
does-
all right,
what
hold
does
everything.
red smell like?
Let's hold everything.
You're-
Where's morality come from?
I told you. I explained
Where?
it to you. Darwinian evolution explains morality. And I explained it to you. If you didn't listen, that's up to you.
I listened to you, but you
Then
said,
repeat
but
it
you
back
said
to me.
it's
Then repeat
subjective.
it. Then repeat
He's
it
gonna
back
take
to
you.
Yeah.
He's taking you.
Anyways, I would say this. I
Huh?
understand. Religion comes from people
me
being
finish
scared
up.
of dying. All of you guys are scared
You gonna
of
take
dying.
them?
My
I got
friend
you.
heard it to an extent.
Are you sure?
You're scared
Okay.
of dying.
Patrick,
and
God bless
God,
you. Thank you for coming.
specific
All
God
right?
that you
I'll
believe
send-
in gives you
I'll send you the
an
video
out
of you preaching.
for what happens when you die.
God
You're
bless you.
scared of it, and I get it. Dying is scary, and that's
not scary
it
for
makes,
us.
It is.
We know where we're going.
I know that, and
know where
so
we're going.
without that, it'd be scary for you, and that's why every religion has this in common. That every religion has a heaven or something somewhere positive. Where
But you
go
could be
when
wrong
you
about
die.
all those things, right?
100% I could be wrong.
Exactly.
100%.
Exactly. So you lost the argument.
And
There's no reason
then you
to
don't
listen to you.
understand arguments.
No,
you don't understand
no.
arguments. You don't understand conversations. You,
You-
literally don't
you don't
understand.
have
I would go as far as to say you don't understand what words mean.
Listen.
You literally do not understand the words that come out of your mouth.
listen.
They make no sense.
Okay, listen. You don't have an absolute standard,
So what?
and you use absolute statements.
Who is the burden
Don't
of
you
proof
see?
on, by the way?
Don't
To
you-
prove
you.
Oh my God.
You.
Okay, so
for
I
your
will say
statements,
this.
not for my
If
statements.
you
For your
honestly believe
statements.
this is why these conversations are circular. If
It's
you
not
want to
circular.
presuppose
Yours
that a God
is circular.
exists, it's up to you to prove that God exists. It's not up to you to prove.
Proof
you
presupposes
you
it.
cannot prove a negative, and
Yes.
you want to play these
Proof
word games, and
pres-
you should
it's not a
understand
word game.
that.
It's not a
So
word
it's
game.
up-
You
listen,
have
I
no
feel like
legs
you
to
haven't
stand
said
on.
little, which actually makes me think you're a little smarter than this guy.
No,
And what's your standard for that?
What's your standard for
You don't
that?
have a
I want
standard
you-
for.
if I-
You see?
would
You
have
see what he
to
does?
If I want to tell you
There's
that
no
this traffic
standard.
light exists, it's
Our
up to me
idea
to
is the
prove the
same.
traffic light exists.
How do you know this traffic light exists?
We could talk about that.
How do you know it exists?
But if I wanted to hypothetically
How do you know it
prove-
exists?
Oh my God. I'm not going to have a conversation if
How do you
every
know it
5
exists?
seconds you interrupt me. Listen, you guys, I truly pity you. I truly pity you.
Why? What's wrong? What's wrong with
Because
us in your
you're
worldview?
wasting your life.
What's wrong with wasting?
I get it.
What's wrong? What's wrong with wasting life in your
I I truly believe you are.
What's wrong with
And
wasting
that's-
time in your worldview?
because we are limited on this planet. We don't necessarily.
And what's wrong with that? How do you know
don't
that?
have an afterlife.
How do you know that you're not sucking this planet dry? And
I
you
don't
should die.
know that. So here's the problem.
How do you know that?
That you two, I fully are the
You don't have
victims in
problems
this.
in your worldview, my
And
friend.
almost you
We
two.
all are ambassadors.
No, we all
You
have
don't-
to find our way.
you
back.
don't
Even if
have
he's
problems
teaching
in your
them, when they get
worldview.
older, they're gonna have to
You don't have
relearn on
problems
their
in your
own,
worldview.
like
You
I
can't have
did.
problems in your
My
worldview.
world review is
can't
one
have
that
everything right.
I accept the evidence of which there are.
There is no evidence
of which
in your
there is
worldview.
proof for, and don't accept which
There
there's
is
not.
no way
if
to
there was evidence
determine
for God, I
truth
would
in
be
your evidence.
so happy for that to
You
happen.
use God's
That's
evidence
why
every
we're
day.
all
Life after death would be awesome. There's no evidence for it. Zero.
There is
And
no.
to say
There is-
You have
truth
no.
presupposes whatever means
That-
nothing. It's a meaningless statement.
But to you,
make me no.
there's
to
no.
anybody
But
with
to
any
anyone
common
that
sense.
uses logic,
looking,
it
bro.
does
With
make
anyone
sense.
that wasn't indoctrinated and isn't brainwashed by the shit that you're spewing.
When you
It's
don't
not
have an
blind faith,
absolute
there is
standard,
intelligence
yeah,
in
when
that.
you
Do
don't have
accept
absolute
that
standard,
you need faith for
you
Christian, or is just
can't know
to be-
anything in
to
your
believe in any
worldview.
God. Forget about Christianity for a second. To believe in any God, do you accept that you need some faith to believe in your God?
Yes, you need some
Okay,
faith, 'cause we
so I'm
can't-
going to give you my example for this, and I'm going to go after this. I'm not going to keep doing this.
Okay.
But I refuse to have faith. I refuse to have faith. And the analogy I'll give
You do have faith.
I do not have
Yes,
faith.
you do.
I accept things of which there are evidence with. I
That's
try
faith.
to avoid faith at all times.
You have
That's
faith in the
faith.
US
There is-
dollar.
That's
No,
faith.
I do not at
So
all.
why do you use it?
What a horrible
Yeah,
analogy.
yeah,
why do
that's
you use
that's.
it?
I've
that's
tried
not-
to avoid it.
Then why do you use
I've actually split my liquid net worth over a variety of
You don't have a
currencies
standard
because
for
of that very
truth.
reason.
You don't have a
Anyways, I'm
standard
not
for
gonna go into
morality.
this.
Okay, so
You
you say
don't
you
know.
don't have
You don't know
I
anything could be
explained to you
true,
where I got
and
my
you want to
moral-
give. And you want to give advice.
Sir, I explained
wanna
to you where
give
my
advice.
morality came from. You heard it.
It's
I know
subjective.
you did, and if you did,
It's
it's up to you.
subjective. Morality is subjective in your worldview.
To say that what you're talking about subjective is to
It
say
is.
the least.
No,
Anyways,
morality
gentlemen,
is subjective in your
gentlemen,
worldview.
I don't appreciate what you're doing.
Why?
I think
You don't.
because I feel like it's abuse for these kids.
What's your
Where's
standard
the
for
view?
that?
Have to.
Because you
What's your
can't prove
standard?
it, and I feel like you're indoctrinated.
What's your standard?
Okay.
I'm
What's
gonna
your
go
standard?
by I've explained
Do you
to
know
you
what-
You don't have
it's
it.
It's
You
about
don't have
Darwinian
it.
evolution. I'm
Hey.
not gonna get into more into it.
100%.
I
have-
don't. I
you-
pity you guys.
You
I
have no
feel
legs
sorry.
left, my friend. You
I
have
feel
no
sorry
legs
for
left.
you.
No,
You
don't
have
be
no
sorry
legs
for
But
left.
I truly mean that. Believe it
Brother,
or not,
look.
I don't have a God. I don't want to hold on your.
You do have a God.
I bet you.
And he's
I
gonna
bet
judge
you.
you.
You say you have a God?
You have a
I'm
God.
unaware
He's
of the
gonna
existence
judge
of any
you.
God. I'm unaware
You're
of the
guilty of
but I'm
sin.
open
You're gonna
the
go to
existence
hell.
of all the
If you
gods
don't
you were able
repent,
to
you will
prove
go
it.
to hell.
it
If you
is.
don't repent, you will go to hell.
So atheist agnostics, those words get convoluted. I suppose, and this is not something I care about that much, but I suppose agnostic would be a better term, meaning I'm unaware of the existence of the God, but I'm open to the evidence for any God, let alone anything.
But you don't have a standard to judge the evidence.
For evidence.
I'm not.
Don't give him any evidence. He
I'm
knows there's
open
plenty
to
of
the
evidence.
existence
He
of
knows
I'm
God
not.
exists. He knows God
What about-
exists.
What
He's
about-
without
Again, I've said my
excuse.
piece.
He's
I've
without
said my
excuse
piece.
on
I wish we
Judgment
could
Day,
have
brother.
more of like a-
Paul,
Wait.
he's without
Honestly,
excuse
I
on
will tell
Judgment
you,
Day.
I wish we could have had more of a toned down
It would help if
conversation.
you keep answering
If you
questions.
answer, we would have
You ask
conversation.
questions that are nonsense, sir.
No.
Sir, and you
No,
two, I
it's
will
not.
not say this word, but you, sir, ask
You
questions
don't
that
have
make
a
literally no
standard-
sense. I would compare
You
every
don't.
single question
You don't have a
to
standard
what
for
is the
truth
color
to
of
judge your
green?
evidence.
Why does the universe exist? These are stupid
He's the guy
questions.
who puts the horse
Well,
in back
okay.
of the wagon and
He-
wonders,
this
why am I
whole
not getting anywhere?
Truth presupposes fact.
How come the wagon is not moving?
This
The
is a
horse is
nonsense
behind you.
thing to make people go around in circles. It makes no
So-
sense whatsoever. You
Logic
two have not
doesn't
done
make
that
sense
work,
to you.
so
I
honestly
agree.
Keep your mouth shut, and I
agree
think
that.
that's the right
I
thing
agree.
to do.
Logic doesn't make any sense to you. I agree with
I'm
that.
honestly done with you, sir. You
Okay,
make no
let-
sense. You're a spewing speaker of
I'm-
static.
I'm asking you
Literally,
to
that's true.
justify your
And I find what
knowledge,
you're
and
doing
you
to be
cannot do
abuse. I truly find what you're doing to be abuse to these
Oh,
kids.
what a victim.
You know, it's
I do find them
But you don't have a standard for to judge by.
Jesus loves you, bro.
I
You don't have a standard to
appreciate
judge by.
that you think that, and
Jesus loves you. It's all about love.
I honestly
Brother.
appreciate that you think that, and I know that comes from your heart, and you mean well by that. And I love you. I love my fellow
We
man.
love you too. Yeah.
And I want
By the way,
nothing-
we're
I
not
want-
here to offend
And when
you.
I say that he's abusing these kids, and I know I respect
We're
that.
here to share.
When I say that he's abusing his kids, I don't
You
say
don't
that
have
to
a
insult them.
justification
I say
for
that as
abuse,
like
my
a
friend. You
true
don't have
feeling,
a.
and
You
that I
don't have
wish
a
it would stop.
standard. You don't have a standard.
Do I
You
think
don't
there
have
are
a
some things that
standard
come
for
out of
truth.
religion? Yes, and I think some of that could rub off, and it might be okay. But
You
what
don't
I'm
have
saying
a.
about
You,
it,
you can't
it's
even use
also
those
from a
words you're
position
using.
that
What about
I love.
Israel
I love all
becoming
my
a
fellow
nation?
brothers.
You can't
What
use
about-
those words.
You say you read the Bible. What about Bible prophecy? Doesn't that show that God's word is true?
There are Bible prophecies that have come true. There
brother.
absolutely
You
are.
have- you
Brother.
have any
And there are
church
also prophecies that
Brother,
have not
he's
come
a
true.
cynic.
I'll give you
He's
an
not a
example of
skeptic. He's a
prophecy that's
cynic.
not true. The Bible
He has
dates-
all the
are you
evidence
guys
he needs.
And I'm curious to your position on this. Are you guys
about-
aware that the Bible dates itself? It dates. It makes during the time
But you could be wrong about that, right?
No, I'm quoting the Bible
No,
here.
you could be wrong
I'm
about
quote
that.
the Bible here. So
Because you don't have a standard for
are you-
truth.
I'm honestly not talking to him anymore. But are you?
You don't have a- he doesn't
aware-
wanna talk to me
are
because
you
he has
too
no
aware
standard for
that the Bible
truth.
dates itself?
And what's wrong with that?
It dates the age of the earth.
What's wrong with contradictions in your worldview? You don't have an absolute standard of
Are you guys aware
truth.
that the Bible dates itself? I'm sure you know about new.
What's wrong with
young
contradictions
earth
in your
Christianity.
worldview?
Are you aware of young earth Christianity?
What's
Yes
wrong
or
with
no?
what's wrong with that in your
Young earth
worldview?
Christianity means that during the time of Moses, they start talking about the age of a lot of people. They throw a lot of years out there and a lot of ages out there of people.
Yeah.
And if you do the math, are you seriously? It's no one in this group, and it's a real question. Are you just yes or no, please? I beg you.
Okay.
Are any of you aware of young earth creationism and what the implications are in terms of the age of the earth? Yes
There's
or
no young earth. Earth is 6,000 years old.
So
that's not young.
So the Bible does
That's
date
not
itself
young.
at 6,000 years old.
Right.
Do you guys agree
That's not
with
young
that?
at all.
Do
That's
you agree?
very old. 6,000 years is very old.
So you do agree with it?
Yeah, but you can't know anything to any degree.
So if you listen,
You can't know
I don't even want
anything
to get
to any
started.
degree.
I will give you some credit to agree, so you agree
You
that the Bible
can't
does date
know
itself at 6,000 years
anything
old.
to
That
any
is a
degree
nonsense
in your
statement that the
worldview.
Bible dates itself. I'm not gonna
What's
go
wrong
into
with
it.
being nonsense
Well,
in your worldview?
we don't exactly
By what
know.
standard are you saying?
He just
By what
agreed that
standard are you saying
he
it's
just
nonsense?
agreed that the Bible dates itself at 6,000
By
years
what
old.
sense?
If you have any idea about carbon dating, you guys
carbon dating is
understand
flawed. Don't even
that
get me
the Earth
started
is-
on
The guy who
I
invented
believe
carbon
it's-
dating he said it's flawed.
I actually forget off the top of my head, but it's in the magnitude of millions of years old. Maybe billions, I actually forget off the top of my head. But the idea that you think the Earth is 6,000 or less years old is
The guy who invented carbon dating, he said
exactly
it's
why.
flawed.
And by the way, I don't think these two gentlemen agree with you on that, by the way.
why look for
Which
a
means
reason?
that you don't agree with the Bible and you admit that there are
We do
contradictions.
agree with the Bible.
Do you agree that the Earth is 6,000 years? Because this man does. And he just admitted
Yeah.
to
But
it.
why
No,
look at the
no,
stuff
can I
that you don't
explain? Yeah,
understand
my
and
friend,
deny
he
all the
doesn't know
reasons?
Explain to me
anything
how
to
you
any
know that the
degree.
Earth is
Adam
6,000 years old.
from Adam to Abraham 1,000, right? From Abraham to Moses another 1,000, right? From,
But he can't determine if that's true or not. He doesn't
I'm
have a
listening to this
standard.
man. I'm
From
listening to you.
Moses
I'm not. I'm trying to ignore him. I'm
from
listening to you.
Moses to David another 1,000, right?
Mhm.
From David to Jesus another 1,000.
And then we have our calendar year, which is I see where you're coming from.
Hey, Jesus loves you, man. Don't use this word as a
I
curse
hear
word.
you. But
Yeah, so
how do you explain
from
carbon
Jesus
dating?
to now, from Jesus to dead, $2,000, which
How do you
means
explain
6,000.
We have
the
carbon now
carbon
in our
dating that
universe.
dates
It's only
dinosaurs
5,000
millions
years
of
old.
years
The half-life of carbon
Forget
dating is
about
5,000
that.
years old.
Before.
Did we talk about patriarchy yet?
No, we're talking about, so these gentlemen, I don't know about
We're
him, but
talking
this
about
gentleman
Jesus Christ.
and this gentleman believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, and he was explaining.
Right. This gentleman also has no standard for
There's no
anything.
standard for truth. What's your standard for
I'm not
truth,
joking,
sir?
that's what we were just talking about.
You believe in God?
And he just explained to me
believe in God?
his position on why the Earth
I
is
don't
6,000 years
believe
old.
that
You believe-
women came from man. I think that man came from woman.
Do you believe in God?
No, he
I
doesn't.
believe
He
that
doesn't.
man came from
Anyways,
woman.
I actually
I know, but do you
by
believe
the
in
way,
God?
In all seriousness,
I
No, he
believe
doesn't.
I'm gonna go have a good
Okay,
night.
where do women come?
I
You want to
truly
make it a long
appreciate
story. Where do
the
women come
conversation. I wish I
from?
could have been a little more civil. I feel like this gentleman
come-
I wish you could also answer questions.
plants.
Where do plants come from?
The
I'll play your
situation
game,
that
but
you
at
guys
the
think the Earth and you
can we just get to the
think
end?
the Earth is 6,000
Do you
years
believe in
old.
God?
Do you also believe? I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to argue.
What is
But do you
God?
actually also believe that?
Right.
the Earth- I don't know,
What's your
Christians believe the
absolute
Earth is
standard for
6,000 years
truth?
old. He does, and he does. They
What's
do.
your absolute
So they do.
standard?
Do you also?
God's
believe the Earth
mind.
is 6,000
What's your
years old?
absolute standard? See, it's very easy, right?
Okay.
That's the way you
I believe
conversate.
that,
You just said enough. You
as
just
we
said
know, the Bible.
No, I'm not asking you to agree. I'm just saying that's my standard.
You're right
You
about
don't.
that.
You don't.
You're right about
You don't have
that.
to agree. I'm
And
not
that's
saying
a
for you to
good,
agree. I'm just saying that's my
a good
standard, right?
listen.
I have the right to have that as my
That's a
standard.
good way to put
I'm
it,
just asking you,
because
what's
it
your
gives you
standard?
outs, and I totally appreciate that position. That's the position
Sir,
that I used to
my
take.
standard for
Hey, it's been
truth
translated a
comes
million
from the
times.
mind of
When
God.
we find flaws
I don't
with
care
the
if you agree or
6,000-year-old
not. That's
thing,
not the
is a
argument.
flawed
I'm just
book, in
asking
my
you,
opinion.
where does your
But for you to
standard for
say, hey,
truth
it's been
come from?
translated a million times,
I am
that
saying
answers
you
your
have
question.
not
Hey,
defined
that's
what
why there
God
can be
is.
flaws. And that's
I'm not
why
asking
I
you to
have a
define
problem.
God.
So I believe in the
I'm
Bible
not
for a
asking-
long
I'm
time.
not
And this man, by the way,
trying to define
yes,
God.
and this man, by the way,
I'm just
I
saying
would
that's
agree
what
that
I
there
believe.
is
You don't
a
have
flaw
to
in the
agree with
Bible.
it.
He
I
gave
just
me
want.
reasons why he
I just
said
want you to
that.
have a starting
And I used
point.
to do
What's your
that.
starting point?
But the problem
I wanna
was, is
say
they
that
said that
I
God is
believe
infallible.
You don't have one,
If God is
right?
infallible, then the
comes
people
from
that translate his
Is
words
that
would
true?
also be infallible because he
Yeah.
would
And what's your
understand
standard to
that.
that
And
you know
I
that
couldn't
that's
accept.
true?
So he accepts that the Bible can be
Because
fallible because of man.
I've seen
I do
women
not
give
accept
birth
that,
to
and that's
men,
what led me
and
away
I've
from
never
Christianity.
seen women
Is
give
that-
birth.
Oh, you used to
Have
be
you ever
Christian.
seen a
Yeah,
woman?
yeah, yeah.
I've never
Have
seen
you ever
men
have you
give
ever
birth
seen a
to
woman get
men.
pregnant
Hey,
without a
real quick,
man?
Because I know you heard me. Do you understand
I've
why
never
I left
seen
Christianity?
men
Have you
Because
ever
I
seen a
believe
woman?
because
Have you
of-
ever seen a
because of the
woman
Bible,
get
it
pregnant
says
without a man?
That it's infallible. And we found flaws, as this
Does
gentleman
that
agreed.
be wrong?
And he
That doesn't
gave a
even
reason
matter.
why it's okay.
What do you mean
to
that doesn't?
flaws. I just
Okay,
can't
so
make
then
that-
what's
I
your
can't-
point
I
about
can't
saying
be
you've
okay
never
with
seen
that. I
a
can't
woman
say,
get
oh, man
a
messed
man
it
give
up,
birth?
because I know
That doesn't
God
matter
should
then.
be better than that and
My
should have been
only
able
What's
to
wrong
fix
with you,
that.
man? That's
My
what
only
you
point-
just
allow
refuted
that,
your
and I
own
wouldn't allow that.
standard. standard.
And I'm gonna let you talk, but do you understand why I
What do
came
you
to the
mean?
decision that I came to?
Going in circles. You said that you don't believe that man can give birth because you've never seen it. I said, have you ever seen women get pregnant without a man? You said it doesn't matter.
My only
That
point
doesn't matter.
is that man
I
is
find it
born
hard to
from
believe
woman.
that you truly.
That's your only
deep
point.
down
That's my
do
only
not
point,
have
and I
any
want
doubt
you to
God.
hear
I
it.
find that hard to believe. This whole born again
Wow.
thing. I mean,
He's
it's-
born
This is
as a
breaking
woman.
news.
It
Wow.
is.
You should get a Nobel Prize for this. You should get.
And women.
I'm sorry. We hijacked the silo here. I'm sorry.
Equal.
Of course, men and women are equal.
And they don't need men.
I'm sorry?
They don't need men.
Of course they need men. Women need men and men need women. Yeah.
Have to go. I made my point.
Yeah. All right. That's what happens, man. You don't believe in God, you don't make sense. You don't believe in God, you don't make sense. And this man doesn't have an absolute standard for truth. This man doesn't have an absolute standard for morality, but he wants evidence for truth. But because he doesn't have a standard for truth, he can't determine if the evidence is true or not. If you don't have the evidence, if you don't have an absolute standard for truth, you can't determine if evidence is true or not. You can't even begin to ask for evidence. Then he says that we're abusing children by teaching them about Christianity. He's saying it's abuse. You can't say anything is abusive if you don't have a standard for morality. If you don't have an absolute standard for morality, then there's nothing abusive about it. That's it. We close out. Washington, D.C., we love you. Jesus is king.
Kind of effed up in that way. Like to say that, hey,
Brother,
if you
good to go?
dream about masturbating,
Wanna take the-
then you're going to go to hell, even if you don't act on it.
Okay.
That's,
You got it right? You're good to go?
Okay, look.
And by the way, I know you dream about that. Everyone does.
God bless you.
He's a pervert. Don't listen to him. God bless you. Doesn't have a
Say
standard for
that makes
truth.
you a horrible person.
You-
And
you-
again,
you
it's
don't have
why
a standard
I
for
find-
truth.
Again, that's why I find to be abusing these
That's
kids.
pervert. That's a perverted thing to say. And their children are out. That's abusive. That's abusive. That's abusive.